As an amateur writer and a man who understands all the important aspects of storytelling, or at least like to believe he does, I have on many different occasions conceded the importance of adding new characters as a story progresses along. All too often, however, I've noticed that writers tend to overdo the new characters at the expense of the old, and have even come to see a major focus on new or reinvented characters over pre-established ones as a pretty big red flag that a sequel or continuation won't be very good. Because what people have to keep in mind is if an old character or group of characters is beloved by the audience, it's for a reason, and that it won't be appreciated if they're sidelined in favor of characters they aren't familiar with, and especially if they're badly written ones to boot. And today, I'd like to take a look at a few different franchises that got this both right and wrong in order to properly demonstrate what I'm talking about here. But just to warn you right now, there will be spoilers ahead for pretty much everything I bring up here. So if there's anything you aren't completely caught up on or plan on watching, you might just want to be on the lookout for that. This is going to be the only warning I'll be giving out here. Okay, so to cut right to the chase, I'd like to start off with a textbook example of how not to introduce a new character into a story. And that would actually be from a TV show rather than a movie, Obi-Wan Kenobi. But let's establish a few things here first. 1. Obi-Wan is one of the most beloved characters in all of Star Wars. 2. This show is set during a low point in his life while in exile. 3. The title of the show is literally nothing but the man's name. In other words, if you know anything about Star Wars and hear that there's a show coming out literally called Obi-Wan Kenobi set between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, one would probably assume that it would be a show about him hiding on Tatooine, trying to come to terms with the fall of the Jedi and his own past mistakes. And sure, maybe that sounds a little boring, and maybe you'd expect the writers to jazz it up a bit. But the point is, you'd expect it to be about him, and not unreasonably at that. So why does this new character we've never seen before get so much focus? This show is called Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Darth Vader has a major role as a villain. So please tell me, why are we focusing so much on a random Inquisitor? And it's not just the fact that she's taking focus away from established characters that's the only problem here either. Her entire character makes no sense. Her motivations are completely muddled, she acts like a discount version of Kylo Ren, and in the end her character becomes such a mess I can't even find the words to describe it. It's like the show was trying to be two different shows at the same time, with one being about Obi-Wan Kenobi and the other being about Reva. And don't get me wrong, this most certainly could have worked and has before, yes. But the issue here is that it didn't. Fans were quick to resent her for taking the spotlight away from Obi-Wan, and given how poorly written she turned out to be in the end, many would say that her inclusion was downright pointless. Because the thing is, if there had been some huge payoff regarding her character, fans might have been more forgiving of her taking attention away from Obi-Wan. But because her resolution amounts to nothing and is, quite frankly, one of the most confusing things I've ever seen, I would say that they're completely justified in saying she shouldn't have existed in the first place. Because you could quickly fix quite a few, though not all, of the issues surrounding the show if you take her out. All you'd have to do is replace her with the Grand Inquisitor, a pre-established character no less, give him a smaller part, but otherwise just let him be his menacing and intelligent self, and you would have been able to focus more on Obi-Wan, as well as have somebody that the audience already knows to be a credible threat chasing after him. From there, the show might have very well have been better. All they had to do was not create a new character and dedicate so much time to them. It was that simple. Because sure, there are inevitably going to be new characters in a show of this nature. There's no getting around that. But I feel that a character like Tala was better in this regard. Because she has her moments, and you find out a fair bit about her. But she never feels intrusive or that she's overshadowing Obi-Wan in his own show. She may come close to feeling that way a couple of times, but she ultimately never crosses the line. And the result is a pretty good character who actually manages to have a decently emotional death scene. And all of this basically amounts to the fact that the writers weren't hyper-fixated on her. She was simply playing a part in Obi-Wan's story, not the other way around. But, of course, Star Wars has had this problem in other places as well, especially the sequel trilogy. The old characters feel like they're just being put in for the novelty, and that the only characters the writers have any interest in are the new ones. Now, to be fair, I do believe they got a little better as far as that goes in the third movie, but I still say their rush to introduce and establish the new characters at the expense of the old was a major reason they ended up so divisive. And what makes this especially glaring was that Star Wars was actually pretty good with how they handled new characters under George Lucas. For example, Lando Calrissian and Boba Fett don't completely hijack The Empire Strikes Back. They both have their parts to play, yes, but it's still clearly the story of the characters from the first movie. Lando betrays them and then helps them escape, but it's not his story. And after figuring out where they're going, Boba Fett does little more than just stand there and be menacing, and many would argue that he was better off for it. And then, of course, there's Yoda. But considering the death of Obi-Wan in the previous movie, he's a very logical addition to the story, and one that the audience is fascinated by at that. So it doesn't matter that he has so much focus. And similarly in Return of the Jedi, the only two new major characters are Jabba the Hutt and the Emperor. And again, they are both very logical additions. Jabba had already been mentioned in previous movies multiple times, and they are fighting the Empire after all, so it only makes sense that the biggest threat would be the Emperor or ruler of that empire. And not to mention, if you count his quick appearance in The Empire Strikes Back, then he's not even technically a new character at all. Even Lando, though most definitely having an important part, isn't given that much attention, and instead the focus remains squarely on the characters the audience has already known since the first movie. And even if you take a look at the prequels, all of the new characters are once again only a logical conclusion because they're set before the original movies. And even then, most of the focus is actually still on characters the audience is already familiar with. The point here is, the characters that should be the focus of these stories is never overshadowed or replaced, both in the original and prequel trilogies. It's the Skywalker's story, and though there are some pretty important outside characters along the way, they always remain the focus of that story, as they rightfully should. And to now use a completely different example here, let's take Star Trek. The audience got to spend 3 seasons getting to know the crew of the Enterprise, and when they transitioned over into movies, they remained the focus. Sure, each movie did introduce an important character or two, but they never got in the way of the crew. They never tried to take over the story, and the focus was always on Captain Kirk, Spock, Dr. McCoy, and to varying degrees the others as well. I'm even pretty sure that there were absolutely no new characters of any significance introduced in The Search of Spock other than the villain, and that honestly works to the movie's advantage. And in all the other ones, when they're only having 1 or 2 new characters introduced, the writers clearly knew that 1 or 2 was all they needed, as it's ultimately the crew of the Enterprise's story and who the audience wants to see. And when it came time to introduce new characters, they just wiped the slate clean and started over with a whole new cast. And sure, that did have its fair share of problems, but because they did it that way, it never felt like Picard was replacing or overshadowing Kirk. He was just a different man who happens to have the same position as him at a future point in time. And when they do get to meet in Star Trek Generations, it feels much more like a crossover with the two simply working together. They both have the audience's love and respect by that point, and nobody is overshadowing the other in their scenes together. So, if you haven't guessed it by this point, yes, introducing important new characters into an established series can be a very tricky thing to pull off successfully. But what's also important to remember here is that this really only applies to franchises with a lot of reoccurring and beloved characters in them. For instance, something like Indiana Jones never had this problem, because the reason for that is the simple fact that it was about the adventures of Indiana Jones. He didn't have a sidekick. He didn't belong to some organization that had a ton of focus. It was pretty much just him and nobody else. So when a bunch of new characters were introduced in subsequent movies, nobody cared. Because as long as the man himself remained the focus, whoever was accompanying him on any given journey wasn't as important. Or take something that had a pretty small cast, such as the original Terminator movie. The only really important characters were Sarah Connor, Kyle Reese, and the T-800 itself. And considering 2 of those characters were killed or destroyed by the movie's end, it would only make sense for the sequel to have different characters. It makes sense that John Connor would now have an important part to play in the story, and with Sarah Connor and a reprogrammed T-800 getting just as important of a part to play, any new characters would be accepted without question, so long as they were well written. But most importantly, they never get in the way of these characters or hijack the story from them. And what did pretty much all of the following installments do? Either write one or both of them out, twist them beyond recognition, or have other characters steal the spotlight away from them. And in some cases, a combination of all 3, in addition to other bad choices, of course. And even something like Back to the Future benefited from using old characters over new ones. Because I'm pretty sure Back to the Future Part 2 doesn't have a single new character of any significance, except maybe the children of the characters in the 2015 sequence, and even then, they're just carbon copies of the original characters. And sure, there are different versions of the same characters too, but in essence, they were the same characters nonetheless. And by contrast, I think part of the reason why Part 3 wasn't quite on the same level as Part 2 was because it started introducing new characters that ended up taking over the story, losing most of the charm that the sequel was able to somewhat replicate about the original movie in the process. Now, once again, as a man who's written books, I will freely admit that adding new characters to new installments of franchises, in whatever format they may be, are very important. But at the same time, what's just as important is how these characters are introduced and handled in that story. Because as I've gone on at length about, all too often the writers are obviously going for a passing of the torch kind of thing, but sometimes it ends up feeling like the new characters are snatching that torch away rather than it being handed to them. As I said before, though it can work, I honestly think if you're going to do that, it's better to do it similar to the way Star Trek did, by either wiping the slate clean or have only one or two minor characters from before be involved. So that way it doesn't feel like the old characters are being overshadowed and replaced. Because what writers seem to forget way too often is that the old characters are the ones the audience is going to be loyal to, not the new ones. So unless the whole dynamic is handled very carefully, it's extremely easy for the audience to come to resent their presence rather than respect it. Honestly, most of the time they're better off being introduced very slowly, making sure to never overshadow the main characters, and if you eventually want them to take over, wait until the audience has grown to like them just as much, and above all, have them take over in a respectful manner. And after, and only after, the old characters have had a long time in that position first. As a writer myself, that's how I would recommend doing it. But even then, I can see why quite a few people these days have developed quite an aversion to new characters being introduced into old properties for fear of them sidelining the old and beloved characters, and I honestly don't blame them. Because in my opinion, they've been getting this very basic concept way too wrong in the 2010s. Alright, that's all I've got on that. So now I'd like you to tell me, do you like it when a sequel introduces new characters, or do you prefer when they're kept at a minimum and the old characters remain the focus? Please feel free to let me know in the comments. And like always, you don't have to agree with me on this video. If you think I'm absolutely wrong about everything I said, you are most certainly free to. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.